Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel and our talk about stigma. I'm sorry it's taken so long, but the last few weeks have been incredibly busy, but better late than never. So we were talking about stigma, and I finished on self-stigma the last time, and what I want to talk about now is the other stigma that we have within society, and that's social stigma. So it exists at a community level, and where members judge traits associated with your mental illness to be different to what's normal in the community. So it actually is, their behaviours are harmful towards people that suffer mental ill health. Social stigma can be overt, subtle, and may be anticipated or perceived rather than experienced. So you could have that paranoia around that social stigma. It runs parallel to workplace stigma, and it's in the workplace that stigma of mental health is felt most by sufferers of mental ill health, and that's from actually Brewers from 2020. So they find that people that suffer the social stigma can actually have those effects within the workplace as well, because it exists in the workplace. The main impact of social stigma is on the employability of people. So actually employing people with a mental illness, people don't do that. If they know that there is a mental illness involved, they won't employ someone. It's basically discrimination. Now, Brewers again goes on to say that mental health stigma is common because people with severe and common mental disorders are 7 and 3 times more likely to be unemployed, respectively, than people with no disorders. So 3 times more unlikely to be unemployed. It permeates through all sections of society, and it's seen in most age groups, from children in the schoolyard to universities and workplaces. Social stigma of mental illness exists and is complex and a considerable problem for society. We have Brewers also talks about this negative attitudes of people in the workplace, disclosure and non-disclosure of your mental ill health, that self-stigma that people carry, which we spoke about, and why should I try effect, and the stigma as a barrier to seeking help from healthcare professionals is all affects unsustainable employment and unemployment. That's what it results in. So all of these attitudes, whether we talk about our mental ill health or whether we have such self-stigma, why should I try? And that barrier to getting help because of the fear of stigma in the healthcare setting results in employment being impossible to maintain and obviously unemployment. In social stigma, it leads to us psychologically and financially and emotionally. It harms a person. It results in discrimination of the individual in the workplace, which actually aids in self-stigma. The effect of social stigma in that social and employment section will affect that person's ability to maintain long-term housing. Discrimination in that housing market occurs for people with mental ill health. People are really hesitant to rent a house to someone who is open about a mental ill health issue or who has a mental ill health issue. This stigma only prolongs that person's unwillingness to get help, to seek that assistance from healthcare settings for their mental illness. And that's they're really good points made by Sickle from 2014 around social stigma and how it will affect us socially and employment-wise and our housing, etc. Hiding our mental illness produces stress, the fear of being discovered, and this is called stigma-related stress. It affects physical health as well as mental health, and maybe will increase those risk-taking behaviours. It'll affect the performance of someone in the workplace. Academically, with our relationships, it can push people towards self-harm and even suicide. It is really that dangerous and that powerful, the stigma of what it can do to people. Um, and when we look at mentally healthy workplaces, that's obviously should be an aim for all people who run a business, or PCBUs. Um, that mentally healthy workplace would have a positive effect on that individual. That fear factor would not be there for them to come out about their stigma. But just having those mentally healthy workplaces just doesn't depend on the mental health of the workplace, because there's many factors that contribute to how mentally healthy your workplace is. And they vary between the home and work conflict, the makeup of individuals, the support that's available. And we're not just saying put an EAP in and that's enough. We're talking about real tangible support here from workmates, from mental health first aiders, EAPs, from you might be doing CBT or mindfulness training, redesigning work so it's not so stressful and causing issues, and organisational factors. So everyone in that organisation through those levels of leadership are trained in stigma, what stigma looks like. You're minding your language. Supervisors are always reminding people to mind their language. Workers are reminding each other to mind their language because stigma is real and exists. So a question, so where does stigma sit within a mentally healthy workplace as a factor? Okay, we need to look at that, and we need to look at our workplace, listen to the conversations that are happening between work colleagues, between supervisors, and actually see whether stigma does exist. So some factors that we just spoke to about contributing to mentally healthy workplaces, especially around job design, demand and control, resources are available, management commitment, the characteristics of the job, and if people are exposed to trauma. Workplace supports, which we spoke about, those relationships in the workplace, organisational factors within the workplace, so that again, recognition and reward, organisational changes, the justice, how psychologically safe all those teams are, and the physical working environment. This is where stigma sits in, and those organisational factors. And you combine that with homework conflict and individual factors, you can have good or positive or negative mental health and wellbeing outcomes. So that's just a real overview. And if you're really interested in that little discussion I was just having with you, Harvey et al., 2014, have a really good graphic around that that you can have a look at. And it explains it really well, how the job design, the workplace support, the organisational factors in the workplace, plus the homework and conflict, plus individual factors equals that mental health and wellbeing outcome. So again, that's Harvey in 2014. That you can have a look at that diagram. Okay, so let's move on to structural stigma. It's stigma that's found in the rules, policies and practices which we have in society, and it'll stop someone with mental ill health from joining in society. This form of stigma can in turn worsen poverty for people, which then will have an impact on further health issues, both mentally and physically. Structural stigma, the origin of structural stigma, stem from institutional racism, for example. Such as banks and governments implementing rules that made it harder for certain people of certain groups to progress in their life, and careers by changing the rules all the time to ensure that those people from those groups stayed where they should be. I mean, you can think about apartheid, the White Australia policy, and Hatzenbuehler from 2016 have some really good information about this. The type of stigma is used to target or contain certain minorities, marriage between minorities, consequences felt by all sorts of groups. You may have heard of the Jim Crow laws, which maintain that white privilege in some states in America. There's a greater level of scrutiny on people, and we've seen that in Australia, especially around refugees. And structural stigma is reflected through our systems that'll treat our people with mental ill health and addiction as less treatable and less deserving of care. There's cycles of blame, shame, mistrust, and the Conversation 2021 talks about this. There's that shame and mistrust for people who actually seek help for their mental ill health or addictions. And structural stigma, like social stigma, enhances that self-stigma. It results in that person becoming more careful about living their true life, who they actually are. And this has huge impacts on their own mental health and their physical health. Structural stigma can also be intentional, but it can also be unintentional. So according to Livingston, 2013, society is designed for people who don't have a mental illness. Therefore, practices, rules, and social norms become a normal part of society. We accept it. There's complete power imbalance. And these norms, they're entrenched within law, our culture. However, these supposed norms do stigmatise our most vulnerable. So, for example, intentional stigma, restricting people with certain mental illness taking out private health insurance. They can't access certain things. Unintentional structural stigma will also affect the most vulnerable in our society, such as the mentally ill. Unintentional stigma, some examples of that would be that tough on crime initiatives. The recent cashless welfare payments designed for the most vulnerable in our society is a example of unintentional stigma. So it does exist, and a lot of the time it plays on our fears, which I believe are derived from myth about people with mental ill health. So in the workplace, people that might have complex mental health needs have very low engagement rate compared to the general population. Companies can make it difficult for people with mental ill health to gain that employment by failing to adjust the system of work. So redesigning that work to accommodate or assist that person who has that mental ill health. Now, Australian data shows that people with these complex mental illness have much lower rates of employment compared to the general community, around 21.5% versus 72.4%. High rates of homelessness, 5.2% versus 0.5%. So structural stigma requires further study here in Australia, and it's important that we remember as a PCBU, we are legally required to make reasonable accommodations for people with mental illness. And Rivalli and Morgan 2021 talk about this. I'll just say that again. We're legally required to make reasonable accommodations for people with mental illness. So that's a legal requirement. Now, when we address structural stigma in the workplace, it should look at a few points. Do you have an actual stigma policy? Does it meet your company's needs? Do you have a job or task redesign policy or procedure that actually accommodates someone with mental ill health? Do you do surveys in the business to see if stigma actually exists? Actually ask the workforce, is stigma a problem within the workplace? Obviously, I think you would probably need some education around stigma and what stigma is before you start asking these questions, because people could get a bit confused about what stigma is. Does your risk assessment policy allow you to do these risk assessments if you redesign a system of work or a job? And who does this and who's involved? What subject matter experts do you have around stigma and mental ill health and mental health in general? Have a look at all your policies, all your procedures, see if you have intentional or non-intentional stigma within these documents. Educate. Management, the executive, all about stigma, the workplace, educate people why it's not appropriate to have stigma in your workplace, and do those changes, monitor those changes by conducting further surveys in the workforce and see if you are achieving what you're trying to achieve around structural stigma in the workplace. But one thing's for sure, nothing can be achieved without a visible management support. Okay, so we've gone through a little bit there. The next time, and I promise it won't be so long, we'll have a look at some strategies that we can put in place in the workplace around stigma, and hopefully make your workplace, or help you with your workplace to make it a little bit more friendly around mental ill health and addressing any stigma that you may find. Until then, stay safe, and I will see you hopefully within another week when I post again. Ciao.